Hi, I'm David Davis from ActualTech Media, and I'm excited to be on another Spotlight Event Series interview. I'm welcoming Mr. Mike Harvey, founder and senior vice president at Moonwalk Universal. Mike, it's great to have you on. How you doing?
Good. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for being here. So I've been learning about Moonwalk Universal, and the product is Moonwalk. Do you want to tell us about Moonwalk and what it does? What problems does it solve for companies out there?
Yeah, absolutely. Moonwalk is a data management framework. It's a software technology that gives enterprises the ability to define policies for data management, data insight, and data mobility. We are a heterogeneous technology, so we connect to pretty much every platform, every storage platform you can imagine, object stores, and cloud endpoints.
Okay, so I can picture myself, kind of being a CIO out there or a director maybe responsible for all the data in the company, terabytes, maybe petabytes of data. And, my role is to ensure that all that data is secure and that no personally identifiable information is where it shouldn't be, and, ensure that we're all compliant with regulations like GDPR and really just know what I have insight into that data. And is that something that Moonwalk could help us with?
Yeah, absolutely. We like to talk about data insight and data mobility. So knowing what you have and being able to access it, move it around, archive it, relocate it to a cloud, bring it back again, etc. So we see data insight and mobility as going hand in hand, particularly as we hear more about the consequences of data that we're not supposed to have getting into the wrong hands. Especially when we talk about GDPR regulation, if there's European customer data somewhere in the infrastructure, then the regulations of GDPR totally apply, and there are significant penalties when those requirements aren't met.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can see this being a huge problem, especially in even like, I know we talked about healthcare organizations as well with personally identifiable information and HIPAA requirements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean it's an interesting situation. Most enterprises, their infrastructure hasn't really been designed; it's evolved over time, and a lot changes in technology. So, if my storage infrastructure has been running, let's say, for 30 years, obviously products have changed, but my services are basically the same. I have files in file systems all over the place. They can be big NAS clusters like NetApp Isilon. They can be Windows Storage Server. They could be clusters, or I could have standalone Windows servers, which which you find everywhere. So if we're talking of a time span of 30 years, my data has probably been doubling every 18 months or so. And it's important to note that unstructured data is really different to structured data because we don't really know what's in a file. The file name doesn't really tell us much about what's actually in the file. And if data sets have been inherited because of mergers and acquisitions, business units get folded into other business units, et cetera, being able to sustain data insight over long periods of time is practically impossible, I think, until now. I mentioned that we like to talk about insight and mobility, and that's certainly what our technology achieves. But we believe that insight and mobility is emerging as a core requirement for enterprise infrastructure, just like you have identity management, just like you have security, just like you have quality management. We see data insight and mobility as emerging as a real discipline, and enterprises really do need to have those capabilities in the toolbox to manage that moving forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can see where this, it really should have been part of object storage design from the beginning. You would think that, kind of data insight should be in there. And now as the data has grown, organizations are realizing, hey, we really need to know exactly what we have. Is this a whole new product category, would you say?
Look, I think it is. And we've partnered with IBM to produce a solution that provides not only metadata awareness, but also content inspection. So whether actionable intelligence can be found inside file headers, inside file or object metadata, or inside the content itself, our solution can support policies to identify direct matches. Let's say I'm looking for all of the artifacts, files, and objects across my infrastructure that contain Mike Harvey or M Harvey or Harvey M, something like this. Or maybe I'm looking for anything that looks like it has a name, or looks like it has an email address, or looks like it has a credit card number, or a social security number, or a driver's license number, etc. Right? When you're looking for, looking for a needle in a haystack sounds impossible, but at least you know what you're looking for, and at least you know where it could be. But what if you're just looking for a needle or something that looks like a needle in something that could be a haystack? It gets a little bit more complicated. And that's where the if then else pattern logic that we support comes in really handy, so that a customer can create custom metadata tagging to tag artifacts, whether they're files or objects, that probably match a certain characteristic or probably match a certain pattern, or may indeed exactly match a pattern. I'll give you an example. Let's say we're talking about a financial services use case, and let's just say that someone from risk has identified potentially misleading information in a product description, and the product is still being sold to customers. So they want to know, where does this product name occur in all of the literature across customer communication, across internal organizational communication, so that they can get an extent to which this information is out there. So then they can take action. But not knowing exactly which artifacts contain that product name, that product code, or something like that, it's very difficult to even start to try and manage that problem, even if you know it probably exists.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can see that. And also, I know we were talking about in healthcare organizations, for example, with a social security number. Certainly the healthcare organization is going to have a social security number in its data store at some point, but your software is able to find all the different places that social security number might be, and then tell you where it shouldn't be versus where it should be. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Data like social security number, let's say driver's license numbers, patient numbers, things like that, anything that can identify a person and be abused if someone gets that data and they're not supposed to have it, that information really belongs in a database. It doesn't really belong in a file scattered across the infrastructure. It doesn't really belong there. And so, there are certain cases where it does, right? Let's say when you're onboarded as a new patient, you fill out one of these forms, right? There's a handwritten version of that. And that's a file if it's scanned. So sometimes this is true, but those artifacts really don't belong in general file population. They really don't. And once that data has been entered into a database, in my opinion, that kind of artifact should be destroyed because it's no longer relevant, right? You capture that information. Now all it poses is risk. It doesn't add value, but it does create risk. So being able to scan unstructured data, and this is files in file systems as well as objects in object stores or in cloud endpoints, scanning those for patterns or indeed, let's say, exact matches, and flagging those appropriately for action later or taking action now, that's a capability that this system provides.
Very interesting. So who is it and what type of company is it that typically says, we want to implement Moonwalk, we've got to have this?
So it's interesting from a storage optimization point of view. I think everybody with a petabyte or more of unstructured data can get a lot of benefit. Even if we are not talking about the identification of, let's say, risky data or data that we shouldn't have, what about data that's just so old, we probably shouldn't keep it on expensive storage, right? Maybe I'm not worried about the risk of failing to have insight. Maybe I just don't want to spend dollar for dollar on data that no one's accessing, right? Maybe I don't want to do that. So this technology can be used to identify inactive data, redundant data, and obsolete data. And you can take action against that. You could archive it to a cloud endpoint, you could mothball it, or you could delete it. So you've got a lot of options there. So from a storage optimization front, I would say yeah, customers with data sets a petabyte or more definitely can see an ROI in a short period of time with this technology. From an insight point of view, I'd say any organization where data stewards, risk managers, the CIO or the CFO lose sleep wondering what they've got out there, regardless of the amount of storage or the number of elements they have, if there's concern, or indeed if the consequence of failure is significant enough, then that's really somebody who should be talking to us.
And so you bring up a really interesting use case there that we hadn't touched on before, and that's the data optimization use case. I mean, so many companies out there, they just have massive data sprawl, and they're afraid to delete anything because they don't really know what they have. And so this solution, Moonwalk, could come in and help them to identify what they have, maybe archive it onto less expensive storage, or potentially get rid of it as well. So I really like that use case. And then I also want to touch back on the risk management use case, identifying the data that you have and what's inside that data. I know we talked about you don't have to have a person manually review all of the personally identifiable information that's found. Your solution can do that for them. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's a tricky situation, right? Because you want to be able to read everything, right? You've got to be able to have insight. In order to have insight, you've got to have access. But it's not appropriate to give one person, or indeed many people, access to everything. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So the way that we've solved that problem is to give the system access to read everything that it needs to read as a system user, not a person, not an organic life form. And the system can then execute policy against the data that it can read and flag those items that are in violation, or those that trip a pattern, or whatever the policy requires. And those reports can be provided to human users, but not the underlying artifacts themselves. So human beings can make decisions about the next step, the next course of action, without ever having to look at that data. So an organization can achieve the compliance requirement without breaking their security requirement. And that's pretty important, because whenever you look at these kinds of projects, there is conflict between different policies, security and compliance. Those two policies can butt heads, and often do. And this is an elegant way to resolve that problem.
I like that. So this is software that can go out and talk to all the different storage arrays that you would commonly find in an IT organization, and then based on rules, give insight and potentially movement or action based on the insight and rules and policies that are configured. Is that right?
That's correct. And we take it one step further with a feature we like to call AI pipelining. So one of the features of IBM Spectrum Discover, which is the content engine with which we've integrated, it has a feature called Cloud Pack for data. So you can make the catalog available to the Watson AI framework. So let's say that you flag artifacts as potential security risks or potential PII risks, but further inspection is required to get an absolute hit, an absolute match, or absolute certainty. You can then flag those artifacts for AI pipelining into a modeling environment for deep learning or machine learning to further score based on sentiment analysis, the kind of language used in the documents, etc. So the insight and mobility, it begins on-prem, but it could end in a TensorFlow or scikit-learn environment with much more complexity and much more sophistication in those models. But you wouldn't be able to achieve that end game if you weren't able to provide access and insight in the first place.
Excellent. All right. Well, Mike, so if folks are watching this and they know that they need data insight and greater visibility into their company's data, what should they do to get started with Moonwalk?
Reach out to us, www.moonwalkinc.com, and start a dialogue. We do offer data insight services for qualified customers, and that usually includes the extent to which data is infrequently accessed, as well as the extent to which personal information may be exposed in unstructured data. So we do offer data assessments for enterprises who think they may have a problem but aren't 100% sure. This gives them the ability to, put their feet in the water without having to make a massive investment up front.
Excellent. Yeah, it sounds like this could help so many companies out there I know that are struggling with data sprawl and just getting insight into the data that they have. Mike, thanks so much for joining us on the Spotlight interview series today.
Yeah, that's my pleasure. Thank you.
To our audience out there, if you enjoyed this Spotlight series interview, check out the others that we have on our YouTube page. Thank you.